Hello there, beautiful souls. Rosie Glow here with a little 5D focus perspective here for us to be able to see a little bit more fully what the issues are around our maternity care and the impact of the kind of care we receive, both on the outcomes, including stillbirth, and also the guidelines that are available to protect us, to help us have a healthy pregnancy, a healthy birth, and a healthy time postnatally, and the impact this really has on us as conscious beings, because our birth, our time in the womb in the first 7 years of life, really do influence us in ways that we don't even comprehend fully at this point. So for those of you who don't know me, I am Rosie Glow. I channel Divine Grace. My background is in early influences. And just to start this off, this is not a dig at anyone. I really do believe that the maternity services are doing the very best that they can. And we're now looking at how we can actually integrate what has been ancient wisdom, but also consciousness that is going to support us to make better choices. I previously was chair and co-chair and a user rep for the Maternity Services Liaison Committee at Croydon University Hospital between 2004 and 2014. I had a company called Enjoy Yoga, where I run fertility, pregnancy, birth preparation, postnatal and baby yoga classes. I was also a tutor for Birthlight, which is a very holistic approach to the greater enjoyment of pregnancy, birth and babies. And one of my jobs was to offer positive intervention methods to midwives, birth professionals, obstetricians, parents, and to help us see how we can kind of marry the very best of nature and science so that we can prevent as much as possible what is preventable, and to also accept that part of life is death. And for some souls that choose to come to this earth, their experience is one of wanting to be in a womb for a certain period of time and potentially not actually actualizing their life, as in living past their birth or living long into their lives. And I know this is incredibly hard to say, especially to any of you who have lost babies, but understanding our soul consciousness and our human consciousness and bringing the two together is very, very important at this stage in our evolution. My whole journey as an awakening starseed actually started from the fact that my birth was one where I was a vaginal breach with the cord around my neck 3 times. And I did almost die in childbirth. So you could easily say, well, thank God for cesareans, and why didn't my mum have a cesarean? But part of the reasoning that I've come to understand that I had such a tough time coming out was I, one, potentially didn't really want to be born because I was scared of coming to this earth again. And secondly, one of the things that happens in our attempt to be able to understand things and to monitor them is there are certain elements that can actually affect very strongly the outcome. So, for example, I have a real bugbear about women giving birth on their backs, and something I've spent a lot of time learning and researching in my professional and personal life. And if a woman and a baby are not in an optimal fit for being able to help that baby move through the pelvis, then being on your back, even if you're giving birth vaginally, can actually really cause problems. So we want to open a conversation here. And I want to remind everybody as I say this, that if you are triggered by what I say, please pay attention to what's going on inside of you and consider what your own story is, both in your own birth and the births of your own children, and what's going on in your ancestry. And for those who are in the medical profession, there is a huge fear of litigation, of getting things wrong and then being personally persecuted. So there are guidelines in place, but there is a misunderstanding. In England, we have the NICE guidelines. There is a misunderstanding that the guidelines are based on 100% grade A evidence, and they are not. So I was very blessed to go to literally every Birthlight conference that was available, where I was meeting amazing people in the world of birth, including Dr. Michel Audon, and he was actually who trained me as a doula, along with Liliana Lemers. So I've personally attended plenty of births, and I have seen what can happen in hospital environments and what can happen at home. And though we are all intending our very best to prevent mortality, both in the mother and the child, it doesn't matter how we have advanced things in time, including cesareans, including neonatal care, babies do still die, and so do mums. So being able to accept that we are doing our best to create the best possible opening for babies to be born consciously and gently, even if there are interventions, is important. And up until now, our public health system has been focused on offering a sort of blanket solution for everybody. And this isn't just in maternity services, this is in public health in general. And the conversation I really want to open is, do we want to be looking at selective care? Hi, Dawn, good to see you. Do we want to be looking here more at selective care and continuity of care before we have a traumatic experience, and how can we make that happen? And how is it that we have a cross-party manifesto called 1001 Days in the UK, which means that every political party knows how important the first 3 years of a child's life are, including the time in the womb, and therefore there is not enough funding attributed to pregnancy care and birth and postnatal and baby care, and there really should be, because the impact this has on our life is our whole life. So, you know, I only learned through rebirthing when I was 14 years old, the process of rebirthing, the effect that my birth had on my expectations of life. And my expectation really was that life is a struggle. Life is, you've got to fight to survive. And basically only when you surrender, because I thought I was going to die, it was at the point that I thought I was going to die that my mother was given an episiotomy and my baby, I was pulled out, that actually I then took a breath and I was here. Now, how much of it was preventable? Well, one of the things I have learned through my journey in birth work is that the internal circumference of a pelvis can actually increase by nearly 30%, 28%, if you do work with the body, you work with the optimal opening for the mother to help the baby spiral through the pelvis. And also you focus on optimal fetal positioning. That means helping the baby to enter fully into the pelvis before the birth actually occurs. So the photo that actually took as the thumbnail for this is an article that was in the Daily Mail, very, very well written by Jenny Agg. I feel like this was a very balanced review of what's going on. So in my world, I actually stopped teaching pregnancy yoga and doulaing about 5 years ago. And this was because I found it just too traumatic to be involved in what was going on, and finding that in my holistic mindset, what I was saying and what I was offering in my classes in terms of information about how to support babies to be born more gently and consciously was being directly contradicted through the services. And that was no one's fault. Okay, this is not a dig at anyone, and I am sharing my personal opinions here. Okay, so what I want out of this video is just to open a discussion of how we can move beyond fear of litigation and fear as a result of personal trauma in birth workers and women who have given birth before and had traumatic experiences, how we can actually process that fear so that we can not have that influencing the decision making in such a way that it's going to create negative impact in those that we actually work with as birth workers, and also in our own story as women and men giving birth, as the mothers and fathers of the babies that are going to be born. And you'll say, oh, this is anecdotal, but you know, in my experience, just so you've got an idea, in the time that I was running the pregnancy yoga classes at in Croydon, in South Croydon, and I was working directly with Croydon University Hospital, I worked with over 5,000 women and their babies and their partners, and I really did see some patterns occurring. So I haven't got for you a peer-reviewed scientific study, but what I can say is that a lot of the studies that have informed NICE guidelines are not based on grade A evidence and research. And so that means fundamentally that those studies are flawed. And there are elements in those studies that need to be reviewed, because we're only looking through a certain lens. We're only looking at certain variables. We're not looking at what else actually has an impact. So bear with me. This article was about preventing stillbirth, and it's news to me, actually, that, you know, now it's routine to offer induction at 42 weeks rather than at 40 or 41 weeks. Back when I was doing the birth work that I was doing, it was, you had to really fight to have an extension on the induction, and you were very much scared into having an induction at 41 weeks or at 40 weeks on the basis that, and this is coming from what women said to me, the fear of the placenta actually stopping to function properly. And there is, you know, evidence to say that the longer that a pregnancy continues, then the more likely it is for a stillbirth to occur, although the numbers are quite small in relation past 42 weeks. So the question is, should we be offering blanket induction at 41 weeks for everybody to prevent those stillbirths at plus 42 weeks. And I'm sure any woman who has actually given birth to a stillborn baby post 42 weeks will say, yes, definitely it is, because it's, you know, you would never want your baby to die if it didn't have to die, you know, if it could be prevented. But there are more things here. So please bear in mind the term throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Our traumatic lens, our fear lens, makes us make decisions that we could actually look at slightly differently and provide selective care. So one of the things I've really taken from this article is the fact that only once you've had a traumatic experience, like a stillborn, for example, will you be offered as standard continuity of care, which means seeing the same midwife every session, you know, having the same obstetrician. And this is through our health service, our free health service in the UK. Now, that really should be standard for everyone. If we loaded funding towards, you know, pregnancy support, pre-pregnancy support, so women and men are really healthy emotionally, physically, psychologically and spiritually before they even conceive, we would start to see a difference in what's going on in this world. And I truly believe that if we want to have a peaceful planet, if we want to outgrow war and trauma, then we have to really look at how we conceive, conceive, gestate, birth and nurture our babies. It is so important. Dr. Bruce Lipton talks about this. He's the godfather, if you like, of epigenetics. And I am on a mission to help people to understand that we are kind of primed for traumatic birth. And I say this having witnessed recently a whole series which Gillian Anderson was in as an older mother. I'm not sure really what I can say and what I can't say, so I don't want to get anyone into trouble here, including myself. But what I will say is that the whole of this series, we had an older mum who was very stressed, being constantly told she was an older mum and the risks were much higher for her because she was an older mum, finding her in a loving relationship, but with a man who wasn't very emotionally supportive towards her. And also, good, thank you, I appreciate that, Dawn. I'm going to try and keep my thread, so I'll look at the messages in a moment. But the whole time that I saw her in every program in this series, she was sitting back in her chair. She was basically priming herself for what I would say a mismatch between the baby entering into the pelvis in a way that would help the labour to go well, to start the labour well. And she was very stressed. She had so much stress on her plate and not a lot of support. Now, the way this actually transpired was she went into labour 8 weeks early, although the baby looked, you know, considering it was 8 weeks early, and the fact that the baby was breathing and put on her chest immediately after, I'm kind of like, okay, interesting, but this is TV, so we'll go with that. And basically, she bled out. She bled out and almost lost her life. But if you look at the scene of her giving birth, she was on her back, being monitored, and pushing. You know, the standard old way of doing things is to be told to push like you're doing a poo. So tuck your chin under, hold your breath and push hard, which really strains the perineal tissue and also restricts oxygen to the baby. So in this situation, we put extra pressure on the arterial connection, which can lead to a problem, which can lead to an arterial bleed. You can also end up with a placenta separation that can cause bleeding. There are all sorts of elements that can occur. And, you know, we want to minimize risk. Okay, so if I am saying something here, it is to highlight the problem and then also the solution, the possible solutions that are there to minimize the risk. But creating a blanket statement for everybody to prevent something that's a small percentage is something we have to look at again and again and again. It's only our fear goggles that would make us think like that, rather than to look at how we could offer the kind of support throughout pregnancy and birth that would minimize this in the first place. And, you know, what a woman is going to need who isn't particularly healthy, maybe isn't looking after her diet for whatever reason, has a high BMI, is very stressed, is in an unhealthy relationship, so an unsupported relationship, is not exercising, is not aware of how to optimize her connection with her baby, building the bond, etc., is going to be very different to someone who is perhaps an older mother, if we say they're both older mothers, because we are having babies later in life now, an older mother who is looking after herself in a different way, is able to transmute stress because she knows how to handle it, is maintaining connection with her baby, knows how to optimize her positioning so that her baby's position will actually be in a better state, and then how to give birth consciously, whether an intervention is needed or not. This is the story that we're now facing. This is what we need to look at, because on the one hand, it's been a long time fighting many birth workers and parents to actually be able to wait until 42 weeks to be able to give birth and not to be forced into an induction. And I remember that some of the research that I came across in the birth work I was doing is that although a normal pregnancy is expected to be sort of 40 weeks, you could say 37 to 41 weeks for argument's sake, it is said that it can actually be as little as 36 and 44 weeks, that a normal pregnancy could be different depending on the height of a woman, depending on the history of that family in terms of when they actually give birth. There is a lot we can learn from the past, and we can then strategize for the future. But we are currently facing a very overstretched maternity service. The last 18 months have meant a lot of people were at home, not doing very much. So a lot of whoopee did occur. And as a result of that, a big baby boom, just like post-war. So with all the best intentions of the maternity services, whatever measures they put in place, can they actually meet those measures? And this is so well written in here that actually, you might want to try and put something in place, and yet, can you actually meet that demand? Because leaving a woman who's being induced on a bed along with a whole load of other women who are being induced and not being monitored, in such a way that their well-being is being monitored, not just the technology is monitoring them, but how are they feeling? Are they breathing deeply? Are they making sure that lots of oxygen is getting to their baby? Are any measures being taken to help to induce the endorphins? Because induction on its own is a process where artificial oxytocin is used. First of all, a pessary, and that pessary is meant to mimic what is in semen, prostaglandins. But some women, when they have that pessary, their uterus starts to go crazy, and actually it can then lead to a cascade of interventions. That's the first stage of induction. Second stage of induction would be to introduce the oxytocin drip or the syntocinon drip if the contractions haven't started and are working effectively, so that they're kind of building up. And obviously, if they can then, if there's enough space in the uterus, in the cervix, to be able to break the waters, that would be another element to speed the delivery up. But there's been an argument for a long time about, cesareans, inductions. What are the risks? What are the benefits? What I'm really interested in is how we can prevent this all in the first place. And it's all to do with our health. It's all to do with our well-being. So here we have, the unfortunate situation where women have actually ended up losing their babies. And, in this particular example, we're looking at Alex and Alex Barr's daughter, Marnie. So Alex is a nurse. She's 33 years old. That's not particularly old for birth. And she was almost over 2 weeks over her due date. But her pregnancy had already been an anxious one. Well, no surprise there. I think she's the mother of one child already before she ended up having another son afterwards, I think. And I might have this wrong, so I'm just sharing what I can now. But as a nurse, you are going to be quite stressed, aren't you? Because it's a stressful job, right? So how well are we looking after ourselves? Are we working shifts? Like what optimizes a healthy pregnancy? How can we help women to be supported to have healthy pregnancies? Is she aware of breathing well and deeply, managing her stress? What is the financial situation in the family? We've all been through the big C recently, so there's been all this extra fear in the collective. And, this has been a big reason why certain interventions haven't been offered that would routinely be offered in the past. Everything is under review, my friends, and it's important. And, it's awful to have something traumatic like this happen to then, lead to more measures in place to try and prevent things without understanding why they're really happening. And in my experience, the stats that we have really do need to be reviewed in a slightly different way, because not everyone is at the same starting point. They might all be the same stage of pregnancy, but how healthy are they is a whole other story. And how do we define health? because, you know, I know this, and I've seen it so many times with the women that I was working with, that when a placenta isn't functioning very well, I have to look at how stressed this woman is. I have to look at how happy she is in her relationship, whether she's breathing deeply, what her workload is like. Like, these are really important elements for us to consider. The moment you start deepening the breath, you increase the oxygen levels in the blood. You also increase the love hormone oxytocin, which is going to start to have an effect on the placenta and the baby. It's going to change things. But there are other factors that are preconception factors, and also how we're looking after ourselves in the early pregnancy period. Because one thing I really noticed was, and again, it's anecdotal because this was my experience, but I'd love to see some studies done on this, that the more a woman is pushing herself in early pregnancy, that could be something like running a marathon. It could be, you know, just having to work really hard, pretending she's not pregnant, working many long hours, that there seemed to be a correlation between early pregnancy stress and then late pregnancy complications. Okay, so these are some of the parallels I saw, and what I'd love to see is round table discussions instead of people going, you're wrong, this is irresponsible, you shouldn't do this. We go, well, how can we look at this? Because one of the things here, it says here, a key piece of evidence that NICE used to make its recommendations was a Swedish study from 2019, which compared women who were induced at 41 weeks with those induced at 42 weeks. It was halted early on ethical grounds, as there were 5 stillbirths and 1 death shortly after birth in the group induced at 42 weeks, but none in the 41-week group. The same year, an analysis of data from 15 million pregnancies published in the journal PLOS Medicine showed that the risk of stillbirth increases slightly but steadily for every week in pregnancy. Okay, so, you know, we stopped the study for ethical grounds. Okay, so we now need to look at the different elements of this study. So the monitoring that's in place, because in my experience, you know, one of the things that we know is the more interventions we have in pregnancy, the more likely there are to be interventions in the actual labor. When we're looking at size of babies, for example, this is a big factor, and I know that our maternity services and our public health services are well aware of factors like smoking on the impact of a baby's weight. But there are other elements too in terms of stress factors. And as I said, you know, how anxious is a woman? How fearful is a woman? How well supported is she? Is she breathing well? Is she being guided to eat well? And some of the guidelines on eating well, you know, are challenging. You know, we're still living in a world where we're not really recognizing the difference between what I would call synthetic versions of something and real versions of something. And there are a lot of synthetic derived vitamins out on the market, for example, that aren't going to be as bioavailable as naturally derived ones. And of course, the naturally derived ones are more expensive. So we have to ask the question, can we not fund that which we know is going to help us to have a better start? That's my argument. Can we not fund that? Can we not look at each woman individually and say, what is the state of this woman? What is this woman going to benefit from most? Because I hear it all the time. You know, the moment you go for an appointment, once you go in for an appointment, you're given a very short period of time. It's a tick list of looking at what could be going wrong in you rather than what's going right for you. There's very little time for discussion. And postnatally, you know, the women I know given birth recently in the local areas around me, it's very, very difficult to get the kind of support that's needed early enough, and guidelines do change all of the time. So how can we make this better? Because as a starseed myself, knowing that means that I am a highly sensitive soul and an emotional empath, and therefore I'm aware of the impact of trauma that is unprocessed in myself and my ancestors and my descendants. I want to know how we can help women overcome fear in pregnancy and fear of childbirth, how we can help them reduce their stress levels, how we can help them to be more vibrantly healthy, and then to make choices based on whether they're willing to take responsibility and able to take responsibility for their health. So they may know what they need to do to have better outcomes, but if they're not in a position to do that, if they're stuck in a cycle of trauma themselves or in addictions, etc., then what extra measures can we put in place? Back in the day when I was pregnant, my daughter's now 20, nearly 21, I didn't have any scans myself. I didn't want to have any scans because I was concerned of the impact of scans, because there was research around the fact that the babies didn't like it and it was potentially interfering with their growth and also their brain patterning. And there is a place for them. I'm not going to argue for the fact they're not, but how many times have I met a woman who said, oh, my baby has got this wrong with them, or my baby is this size, and 3 out of 4 was always wrong, right? So we have these machines that we have these measurements in place that we defer to as looking at those rather than the whole person. And we've come to rely on technology to such a point that we defer our common sense and our instinct as birth workers, and also as mothers and as fathers, to what the machines and what the tests say. And we kind of have to work with both, right? It's not about either or, it's and this and more. And I would like to see far more funding placed in this period, because it's so important, and also far more awareness of the impact of the trauma that birth workers go through, that passes from one generation to the next, and also passes on to those that they work with. Because if, as a birth worker myself, the last birth I attended, or one in the past, had ended up incredibly traumatic or in a stillborn, then of course I'm going to be bringing that with me if I haven't processed it myself. And I'm going to be looking at the earliest possible sign of potential danger, and therefore looking to act very quickly on that, and therefore prevent what might happen later. But the question is, when you're looking for problems, you find them. And there's a very distinct difference between, for example, how obstetricians are trained and midwives are trained, certainly in the past. Now, midwives have been trained more like, obstetric nurses, which is more with an obstetric head, which is to look for problems rather than to expect things to go well and then look for anomalies in that. And, in this instance, I think when you've got an overstressed maternity service anyway, it's so easy for things to be overlooked. And negligence is one thing, but if you are stretched to the max anyway, and you have guidelines in place that allow you to kind of just work with those rather than to look at the woman selectively, then you're kind of covered, aren't you? But it might not actually prevent there being issues occurring as well. So one of the things that I feel is very important for us to understand is when an induction is likely to be something that can go well, and when an induction is something likely to lead to a cascade of interventions. And in my actual training, as it were, one of the things that there were certain signs to look out for. So for any of you who are watching this, key elements that would help to minimize issues occurring are going to good quality pregnancy yoga classes, like birth-like pregnancy yoga classes, holistic pregnancy yoga classes. I don't mean hot yoga, sorry, but I don't mean Ashtanga. I don't mean anything that's holding you tight that you're doing specifically to try and keep your body toned. I'm talking about, the type of yoga that's going to support you to build a bond with your baby, to learn how to sit and stand well so that you can help your baby get into an optimal position. You're training your body to carry your baby in a way that's going to support better birth outcomes, how to reduce stress, how to deal with challenging emotions, how to go about your day in such a way that you are, going to be looking after yourself better, and recognizing that mortality is obviously death rates, but morbidity is when it looks on the surface that you're okay. Baby's breathing, vitals are okay, mum's breathing, vitals are okay, but internally there's trauma that hasn't been processed. And I'll tell you what, when I was actually on that maternity services liaison committee, I did bring forth research that was recent to my colleagues, and they were aware of it, but they didn't have the funding to put it in place. And this was specifically to do with being able to overcome trauma post-birth, so that subsequent pregnancies were not influenced by that trauma, and early detection of being able to sense when a woman really isn't in a great way herself and is holding a lot of stuff inside. So blood pressure issues, they can be very much down to poor diet choices, but also internalized stress and fear. So, when we look at something and we see a vital isn't right, just looking at it purely on a physical level, we're missing other elements that are very important, and we need to start looking at those too. So a holistic approach to pregnancy, to fertility, to pregnancy, to birth, to the postnatal period doesn't mean that we don't also have interventions, but it means we minimize them. So what can we actually do? There's a phenomenal doctor called Dr. Amali Lokugamaji, who I believe, she wrote a book called The Heart in the Womb, and herself, she was an older mother with her first child, her only child. And although she's an obstetrician in London herself, she made the choice to have a home birth. She had severe SPD. She also had gestational diabetes, but instead of going down the medical route that she would normally have prescribed as part of her training, she decided to work with, I believe it was Ayurvedic herbs. It might have been Chinese, but Ayurvedic herbs, and I believe acupuncture as well, and to manage the diabetes and the SPD through what she was learning through her pregnancy yoga classes, and also retraining how she walked, how she moved around in her bed, in getting in and out of the car, getting up and down from the sofa, all the stuff, getting up and down from the floor. Like, how much is preventable? There's a lot more than we realize. And if we start to open that and look into it and stop having the public and private sector fighting against each other, but actually working together, then we really have got, we're setting ourselves up for better outcomes. All right. So I just wanted to say a couple more things on this, which is, we do need to scrutinize the evidence, and we need to look at why we have the presumptions in place that we do, because one of the things that came from learning through these conferences, what was making up the NICE guidelines at the time, was that I believe that things have sped up between research being done that making it into the guidelines, which is great. But obviously research has to be ratified for it to be able to become a standard. And we always have the fear of litigation from the medical insurance companies. So who's really making the decisions and why? And what can we do? Because we do want to reduce the rate of babies in neonatal units, right? In incubators and needing that extra support. Of course we do. We do want to reduce maternal and neonatal mortality rates. Of course we do. But let's not just look at the end here. Let's go right to the beginning and see how we can actually prevent it in the first place. And it does start with education. It does start with educating ourselves how to look after ourselves, how to prepare. When I work with fertility clients, I like to work with them for a good year before they're actually going to conceive, so that I'm working with their emotional, psychological, spiritual, and physical well-being. I'm looking at what they do to manage stress. There are so many patterns that I witnessed and noticed in the time, the 20 years that I've been working with birth work and with pregnancy, that it's time to now open this conversation and to actually say, all right, what can we do to actually make things work in a different way? And when a woman requests something, it's so important to listen to her and not fob her off. Women know, in the women that I knew who did have stillbirths, there are very few, but it's roughly one in 1,000. They knew something was wrong before the technology picked up on it. They knew something was wrong, and it was kind of brushed aside. First time mum nerves, right? That kind of thing. Now, isn't it better to be cautious, to listen to the woman? In the instance in this article, this lady had asked for a sweep. She wanted to kind of go into labor naturally earlier. And she actually started to go into labor the day before her induction was booked, at just before 42 weeks. But she started to bleed in the hospital and was told that, that was normal. It was probably her mucus plug, and just to go home. Now, if she wasn't feeling secure about that, I would personally be wanting to say, well, stay here for a little bit. Let's just monitor you and see what's actually going on. But if there isn't room in the hospital, if the hospitals are short-staffed, that's not really possible, is it? So this is the issue we need to address. It's huge, and it is about bringing funding to the beginning of our lives so that we can prevent the problems later in life. And I don't believe, this is about just testing everybody and jabbing everybody and sending them on their way. It's what we can do for ourselves that is so important. Understanding the impact of our thought processes, understanding the impact of our connection to ourselves emotionally and how safe we feel in this world, and how can we really support parents to bring their children into this world and help them to be thriving rather than just surviving. Because, you know, any mother will tell you it's the biggest job description in the world to be a mum. Same with dads, and it's unpaid. You know, if we actually paid parents to be parents, what would be the difference? And I don't mean, you know, no matter, I mean that to be healthy parents, it's very important. I know I'm banging on a bit here, but it says in this article, unfortunately, there are very few alternatives when it comes to identifying which pregnancies are at risk of childbirth. And this one is to do, you know, I feel like there's a lot we can actually look at, and I've already mentioned that in terms of how we can reduce risk and be able to tell. And it is going to be down to our vibrant health, to our vitality. So when we start to say, you know, women are more at risk statistically the older they get of having complications and potential stillborns, we have to look at how healthy they are, because traditionally we get less healthy with time because we're not really looking after ourselves. And what is considered good health practice is under review. So my invitation is, for those of you who do watch this, please share your experience. Please comment, you know, what do you feel would help? What is the one small difference, that one small change that could be made that could make a really big difference? And how amazing would it be, you know, if everyone was offered kind of prenatal education that isn't mind-based, but is body-based, soul-based, heart-based throughout pregnancy, if we were supported to be in a optimal state before we even conceive our babies, if we were supported to learn how to manage our finances, to manage our lives, if the world, you know, particularly the workforce where we work, was actually educated properly to support pregnant women so that they weren't forcing themselves to go against their bodies. This lady also had hyperemesis. Now, I had hyperemesis too, which is when you are throwing up the whole time in your pregnancy. And, you know, for some women, they require medication and hospitalization. You might remember that Prince William's wife, Kate, she had it as well. Now, hyperemesis is linked to anxiety, to fear, to stress, okay, to fear of mothering. There's lots of levels from a holistic point of view we can look at. And, you know, my history was one where I had bulimia as a teenager. So if I had actually trained my body, you know, to be sick on purpose, then any sense of nausea was triggering that. And there is a link to the vagus nerve as well. So I would say that we actually do have a lot more information than we realize about how we can prevent trauma, both leading to mortality and morbidity. And it is time to start having that conversation and looking at how, obstetricians and midwives are trained, going back to some of the more traditional methods, looking at pelvis shapes, looking at pelvic alignment, look at our physical body's alignment. You get a woman go in with pelvic pain and we give her a belt rather than look at how she's actually moving around in her life and what is contributing to that pelvic pain. So mind, body, spirit connection, essential, because if we can get this right across the board, you know, if we can support every woman to take ownership of helping her pregnancy to be more enjoyable, then we are going to have better results at the end. And this is not what we're seeing in our research. The research that is being done isn't looking at this enough. It's not, as I understand, being funded to look at it enough, because the focus is on pharmaceutical care and pharmaceutical remedies. And that's what I feel we need to look at more. So I'm going to leave that there. And I welcome your commentary. And I certainly do believe that if a woman has had a traumatic birth that may well have, you know, also led to stillbirth, it is so important that work is done afterwards to support those women. We should all get continuity of care as standard. Every one of us should have our fears listened to. And there needs to be a lot more support for the midwives, the obstetricians, all those who are working with birth, including doulas, so that we can actually look at how we minimize the trauma of the practices that we put in place, because the way a woman gives birth really does impact her own sense of self-worth, and also it will impact the baby's expectations of life. So it's important to address that now, and I just want to put that under the microscope. Love you all so much. Thank you for listening. Take care.